Good evening, everybody. Those of you who are here with us in person on this rainy evening, we arranged for you Dutch weather so that you would feel at home, or Belgian weather so that I feel at home. Rather unusual here in Bologna. And welcome to all those also who are following the discussion online. It's a great privilege and a great pleasure to welcome Bert Koenders back to Bologna this evening as an alumnus and as a professor who has taught here in the past. We discovered a little earlier that we both taught here in parallel at the turn of the century, pretty much. So it's a great pleasure to have you back. You also recently gave an extremely interesting talk to our alumni in the Netherlands. Everybody has received your biography, so I won't go through it in any detail now, but former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands and many very important missions for the Worldbank, for the United Nations, one of which we're going to focus on this evening, Afghanistan. We have a rather informal student panel with 4 students who are ready to engage with you after our initial exchange, 3 who are here in person and 1 online. And all of you, whether here or online, are invited to pose questions or to make comments. Those of you online, could you do so please using the Q&A function, and I will keep my eye on the Q&A and filter your questions into the conversation as we go forward. So the subject of our discussion this evening is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the causes of the withdrawal, I might add the manner of the withdrawal perhaps, and the consequences of the withdrawal. And before we get going, I would like to ask you whether this withdrawal was the pivotal event that it appeared to be a month or 2 ago. After the 30th of August, many exchanges of views, and people were asserting that this was a pivotal moment in transatlantic relations, for the people of Afghanistan, for the region, the winners and losers. It was under intense scrutiny. And now, barely more than 2 months afterwards, it virtually disappeared from the media. So do people care about Afghanistan? Does Afghanistan and the withdrawal from Afghanistan continue to have serious consequences for the people of the country and for all of us? Or was it a kind of 1-minute wonder?
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you all of you for having the opportunity to be back in Bologna. It's been my favorite university, both as a student and as a lecturer, professor later on. And I'm very grateful we can talk about Afghanistan today. To go immediately in your question, first of all, yes, it's a pivotal moment for the Afghan people. There's no doubt about it. Every minute since the departure of the Americans, of the governance of the Taliban, to the extent it governs the whole country, we'll come back to that a little bit later. It is definitely a pivotal moment because we see a change of government. They are already, that's not only decided upon or influenced by the fact that NATO and American troops have departed, but they are already for some time also in a very dire economic and humanitarian situation. So the answer in that sense, it's yes for the Afghan people. To a certain extent, it's true for the region, because one of the reasons that President Biden has decided for the negotiations between the Taliban and President Trump to leave the country by September was in fact that this country would be actually left to others. The vacuum created in the country would be filled partly by the Taliban. We'll see if they can sustain that, but it will also geopolitically be now in the hands of the region. We can talk a little bit later what it means for the region. But although it's not a primary interest of most of the countries in the region, maybe except for Pakistan, it definitely is an issue for the countries in the region in terms of stability, in terms of the fear of migration or terrorism. But I know that you are actually thinking maybe about something else. Do we care about it? Do we care about it in the US and in Europe? The honest answer is no. Frankly, Afghanistan was not in the news already for a long time. It became, again, a news item this year after the agreement, or last year, the agreement between President Trump and the Taliban, some of the NATO meetings. But it never went, in my view, on related. The debate wasn't related to Afghanistan. It was a debate related to transatlantic relationships, to the new policy. Was this an America First policy of Biden, or was it being discussed also with others? That was the nature of that argumentation at the time. That is still valid. I'm sure we come to that in the conversation as well, to what extent it has influence. It does have influence, but it's not a pivotal moment. In the West, if we talk about Europe and the US, and I think Biden has seen that, correctly or not, we can discuss. But geopolitically, Afghanistan is not that important. It's been a graveyard of empires. It's been a graveyard of the British Empire and of the Russian Empire and now of America. But in the end, it's not seen as geopolitically and also not geo-economically, I would say, a crucial country. And therefore, it's been left very quickly from the screens, except for two things. And that's important, I think, to note. We see that in general in the world at the moment, the key element of internal politics in the country. In my own country, the Netherlands, 2 ministers had to resign because of the way that the departure of some of the Afghans, interpreters and others worked with us and were handled. And you see, of course,
I'm so sorry.
And you see, of course, also in the US that there was some influence as to, did Biden do this right? Was it not only the right session, but also how was it carried out? So in that sense, it played a role in domestic politics, but geopolitically and internationally, and I'm afraid also when it comes to the real issue of the future of the Afghan people, it is of a secondary interest.
Yeah, that's what I feared. I mean, there's the news cycle on the one side, which has moved on to other issues for the moment, and there are the underlying realities which remain as you have set them out. Maybe we could step back a little bit and you could take us through a little bit your own involvement with Afghanistan. I mean, how did this come about and in what different roles have you been involved with?
First time I came to Afghanistan was just after the American intervention post 9/11. And I understand maybe this public knows exactly what happened at the time. I'll just refer to a few items there. I went with a good friend of mine. I was a member of parliament at the time in the Netherlands, foreign affairs spokesperson of my political party. And we had been engaged to a certain extent with Afghanistan because of the rule of the Taliban. Because they were already ruling right then, and now we're 30 years further, they're again ruling. And I went to Iran, a city called Mashhad in the eastern part. We took a car, which was quite adventurous at the time, going to Herat, which is a beautiful city on the west side of Afghanistan, and with the first Ariana Airways, the Afghan Airlines, after the Taliban and after this intervention, we went to Kabul. Kabul at the time, contrary to right now, where it's a very dangerous city, there's a lot of attacks with insecurity, not only because of the Taliban, it was for the last 15 years, it was a safe city. And we wanted to see with our own eyes what had happened since 9/11 and to what extent the reaction of the international community was the right one, and to what extent, if it was the right one, how it would, what would be the next one. In my own parliament at the time, I'll go quickly through the roles that I had, which is not crucial roles, but important elements of different functions. The basic issue was, of course, after the attacks of 9/11, what would be the answer of the international community, especially NATO, but also European countries, on this attack against the symbols of power of the United States? And we had immediately, my position was immediately determined by the fact, what is the nature of the problem? The problem is terrorism. And what's the best answer? Is it classical warfare? Is it containment? Is it stopping the finance of, in this case, the Taliban, who was still hosting Al-Qaeda at the time? And that was a crucial decision. In my view, some of the mistakes that we have seen in Afghanistan are laying in the fact that a problem of very severe terrorism, an attack in the US, was answered by classical warfare. I'll come back to that in a second. At the same time, there was an enormous feeling of solidarity with the US and the American people of what happened. And so for the first and last time in history, in NATO, Article 5 was called in. That means basically that, you know, an attack on one of the members, in this case in the US, could be qualified as an attack on all, and each individual country could choose to what extent it would answer to that. So in my own parliament at the time, we agreed with the fact that this, you know, was Article 5, that we had to show the solidarity with the US, that the Taliban actually was, you know, they were hosting people who were responsible for this. And so what we did, we agreed politically with Article 5, and therefore the intervention of the United States in Afghanistan. The second moment I was involved in this was not only on this discussion on terrorism and how you answer to it, but also what it means when you intervene in a country. Powell said, once you intervene in a country, you own it. It's not that you just simply can go in and then you figure out what happened. The second decision was a decision we had to take, again, as an opposition member of parliament at the time, if we would support the NATO mission in Afghanistan. There were several other missions that I'll leave for what it is for one moment, which would basically say that, you know, in this country, you should not only focus on Kabul, but there would be more areas of the countries that would be important to be stabilized. Between 2007 and so we agreed on a pretty big component of Dutch forces in Uruzgan province, which is a very agricultural, rural, conservative area, even in Afghan terms. And I became Minister of International Development, so we had involved not only the military component, but especially what it means in terms of the so-called 3T approach: development, defense, and diplomacy. These are the three aspects, what was in fashion at the time on how missions should be run. I worked actually, and at that time, very much with Richard Holbrooke, who came later on Special Envoy, as you know, Michael, was for President Obama on Afghanistan. We worked very much on the issues of women's rights, education, agriculture, the whole issue around opium at the time. Going quickly a bit through history, otherwise this takes too long. And again, coming back to the fact that interventions in other countries always have something, not only in terms of implications for the country itself, that's key, but also for the country you're from. We had agreed we would stay for 3 years. One of our coalition partners decided that we should stay longer, and actually our government fell. I had to resign as a minister because of Afghanistan. But later on, I stayed on as Minister of Foreign Affairs for the training of Afghan troops, because you need for any mission an exit strategy. And lately I'm involved in Afghanistan as a special envoy of the Worldbank that deals with some of the development and humanitarian aspects, humanitarian plus aspects, as they call them, on Afghanistan. So these were the different roles. I don't make any judgment, yes, as what was good or bad or how we should look at this. In any case, it's very clear that from any point of view, it seems to me that if you are starting an intervention and 20 years later, the same government as the one that you started your intervention is there, cannot but be seen as a big failure.
Right. Rob, I think you've got some thoughts about the nature of the mission and about what NATO was trying to achieve there. Would you like to perhaps make a comment? Or come and speak at the, yeah, and introduce yourself briefly. Right.
Yeah. How do I? One. Okay. Hi, Minister. I'm Rob Levinson. I'm a student student here in the Master of Global Risk program. I joke that I'm the senior student and I'm a little bit older than my fellows. Among other things, I was 20 years in the United States Air Force. So one thing I'd like to say is I was in the military in 9/11 and when we were attacked, and then when NATO invoked Article 5, which for those of you who don't know, this is the first and only time that NATO has invoked Article 5. It was originally designed to defend Europe basically against the Soviet threat. And I was profoundly moved by our European allies doing that. I'm grateful for the support that we got from the Europeans in this attack. But I guess my question is, and you've touched on a little bit when your last remark about a profound failure. In your view, was there anything we could have done differently that would have produced an outcome that is more in line with what we would have liked to have seen, i.e. some kind of semi-stable Afghan government that was developing and not harboring terror? The goal that we all sort of went in there initially to try and achieve, or was this simply a bridge too far?
To use a Dutch metaphor.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
And
right.
even in the city I was born in Arnhem. So it's a
Wonderful movie as well.
Actually I'm in it, but there's a little boy figure running over the bridge, not a main role at all. And it was never filmed in Arnhem, but in a small city on the other side because it changed too much. David, I'm not trying to get out of your question, although it's a very complex one because you can. It's sort of a what if history, isn't it? It's very complex. Look, I think things could have been made differently for many reasons. Let me make 3 points on where I think mistakes were made, and then the question remains: could these mistakes have been avoided, or could it have been done better? I think the first mistake is, and I've worked a lot in United Nations missions and peacekeeping missions, is that if you decide to intervene in a country, and I leave for the moment good or bad, but it happened as you said, and for very understandable reasons, and on the basis of Article 5. You first have to immediately realize that when this happens, even if you have little time, what is the next step? If we look at interventions in the last 20 years, there's one statistics that is very important. If you become immediately exclusive in the way you negotiate peace, you'll have the next conflict in your country. Let me give you the example, the famous Bonn-Petersburg conference in 2001 and 2, in which after the intervention of the Americans, there was also the idea to involve the Pashtun and the Taliban actively in negotiations, was not accepted by the Secretary of Defense in the US, not by the President. I think it was mistake number one. I think you have to be as inclusive as possible, because otherwise, especially in a country that went through a modernization shock already under communism and later on with the Taliban, that was a mistake. The second mistake is, if you involve yourself in a country, then don't do something else at the same time. The Iraq War, which was a unilateral, illegal war, which in my view, especially from the European side at the time, I was in favor of the intervention in Afghanistan, but very much against the Iraq War. I'm not trying to make a point on this because you could differ on this, but it's pretty clear that if you do something like Afghanistan, you don't play with the country. You really have to put your energy, diplomatic, in terms of defense and so on this. The third issue, which I think was really a mistake, and again, the question remains, could we have done this better? And I was very much discussing this at that time with Richard Holbrooke, who under Obama tried to make this mission a little bit more, not only an anti-terror mission, but a mission that also would look at the inclusivity and people of Afghanistan from different ethnicities. As you know, some of you, it's a very complex country, landlocked, with different groups. And the question was very much at that time, if you do only an anti-terror mission, and I'm not saying that we should be naive on using the military instrument, but it is very clear that if you then fund the warlords and the enemies of the people, you're going to create again your own enemy. You saw the Taliban becoming more and more important. And most of the Afghan families, what were they doing? They sent one son to the Taliban, one to the government. They were hedging the future. It was unclear. It was very clear that on the key issue, what do people count for? A certain amount of justice, jobs, and security. That's the first things you want as a citizen. You want to make sure that that is done in a way which is not exclusive. And I think that's what was happening. The last point I want to make is you need an exit strategy, and that's the most difficult thing. We have seen that in the failure at the end, that the Afghan army fell as a card, as a house of cards. There is not a simple exit strategy. I think we come to that a little bit later in the discussion today. But I felt very much at the time as a development minister, so somebody who works on the agriculture, the climate, enormous climate issues in Afghanistan, they are tremendous at the moment, food issues. That you have to do two things. One, you have to be a little bit humble. Those nation builders who think they can make from Afghanistan a Denmark in their own perception within 10 years are deciding for others and doing something that is not related to the country. Doesn't mean, by the way, that Afghans don't want to have their voice and their food and their security and their rights. It's wrong. I sometimes hear now that intervention was wrong because the Afghans live in the Middle East. They don't. The country has changed, and that's a wrong assessment. But I would say, nevertheless, that I was very shocked by the fact that much of the American development money went to the warlords and the local leaders, and it stole the system of corruption. And therefore, at some point, and you see that in many missions that I've worked on, that actually the government you want to work with as the better ally in creating a situation in which people feel some element of stability and development is actually completely incoherent, and corruption plays a role. Again, there, we like in these days to big 24/7 news cycles. The government wasn't only corrupt. A lot of good things have happened also in Afghanistan. Education of women, civil society, tax systems, a lot of things have improved. But overall view was, I think that played to some extent a role for President Biden. Who am I defending there actually? Am I defending a government that actually is legitimate in view of the people? And don't forget, it was the US government that adjudicated the elections in Afghanistan 3 times. So in short, a lot of mistakes were being made. Would have been avoided, not with the level of ambition, if you do nation building and anti-terror at the same time in one mission, and you don't prioritize. And the rest is what if history that I don't know. But in my sense, this could have been done differently, and especially also, and there are a lot of people who disagree with me, including the exit, because in my sense, a lot of people feel betrayed. Although the reasons of all this are very understandable, as we just discussed, it's geopolitics, now it's the competition with China, it's the internal politics in the US, making sure that there's more internal coherence in the US. But my what if history has to stop here. Thanks for the excellent question.
Thanks, Bert. We have a question from Juliet online. Is she able to make herself heard? Juliet, can you turn on your, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. I think if you can hear me well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah. So my name is Juliet. I'm first year MAIA, so International Affairs student here in Bologna. And I also studied 3 years in The Hague in the Netherlands. So I perfectly know the weather that you were referring to in the first part of the conference. So I guess my first question actually regarded your involvement, which you've described a little bit. So throughout your different roles and the different decisions you had to deal with, what would you say was your most challenging experience that you faced? And also, I was curious, when you were, as you stated, in Afghanistan, what was your relationship with the people on the ground?
Well, let me start with the last question because I think it's the key question. The relationship in my formal roles, as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Development, was overly limited because of the security situation, which immediately means that I was severely handicapped in understanding what was going on. Obviously, we have civil servants, we have NGOs. I worked with an excellent organization, the Tribal Liaison Office. I don't like the word particularly, but they were really on the ground everywhere and seeing to what extent, I'm talking now about the development part, to see if our programs worked or not. And I've always kept a lot of contact with Afghan civil society, women's organizations, but also people from rural areas, including from the diaspora. But if you ask me, what is the risk of international missions if they're working in very insecure situations, is that they lock themselves in a protected area and don't really see what happens in the country. So it's just, you know, I hope I could have done more of that. I should do more of that. I see right now, again, in this time in which there's much more skepticism of intervention and much more skepticism around global solutions, including UN missions and so on. But this is one of the key questions. How do you make sure that you're actually listening, and not only listening, but also translating with a certain humility what actually is present in the country? And that's not so easy because there are a lot of contradictions. People don't fight for nothing. Not that there's one view or something like that. That's the first question. On your first question, look, I find them all very difficult, but very challenging and interesting and important as well. I guess I found it incredibly important and difficult to find the dilemma in 2006, to what extent the decision to send military from your country to another country is, like in the US, also in the Netherlands, one of the most difficult ones you can take. We have also lost soldiers in different provinces. I found that very difficult. And I think everybody who now looks at the consequences and results asks also this question. Are the lives of those who lost their lives, I know this plays also in the US military, of course, have they been worth it? Right? It's a difficult word, have they been worth it? And the answer to that is only to be made by those who are their families, I think, not from some politician or administrator. It doesn't take away that, in my view, it's not only the situation we're in right now. In my view, Afghanistan has fundamentally changed in the last 20 years. And I think for a lot of things also for the better, if I look, and that's now in peril and in danger. People find it sometimes a bit exaggerated, but I find it very crucial to know that at least 75% of the girls were in primary education. It was 0% in 2000. 40% were civil servants in women, that actually issues that are more in the software of things. You know, development is not only something about so many cars or so many roads, it's about changing on the basis of the local realities. For instance, issues like tax income. In tax alone, you're not dependent on the rest of the world. That we were starting to make a lot. So in that sense, I think you have to realize that you never start in a country and then it ends. It's their lives, it's their history. Many people don't know that. I mean, Afghanistan was the Persian time, famous area, Bactria. Had enormous history and culture in Afghanistan. That's not all gone, and that's not going to be decided upon by foreigners. But that was a difficult moment, definitely in 2006. I find the time particularly difficult also right now for the reasons that the Professor was mentioning. At the moment, I don't think many people care. We have in the moment in Afghanistan, for reasons that are complex, and if we go in the economy a little later, maybe that's good to mention. But we have an enormous amount of internally displaced people. We have a food crisis in the country. We have no foreign exchange. There is no correspondent banking. There is the risk of 30% reduction in GDP. Maybe we could go into reasons a little bit later, but in terms of the humanitarian situation, it's absolutely dismal. And the big challenge for the international community will be, if they are still interested, and I'm not talking about only Europe and the US, but it also involves China, Iran, Russia. What do you do in the dilemma recognizing and legitimizing the Taliban versus a collective punishment of the people of Afghanistan? Because they have become so dependent, and that's a mistake in my view, on international aid, that in Afghanistan will happen exactly the same as with the military. Maybe 90% of the military expenditures in Afghanistan were foreign financed. Can you imagine how unhealthy that is? 90%. And then, you know better, sir, than I, so I correct me if I'm wrong. But if you then leave all the people who serve the Air Force and sort of the support systems, you know, it is not so unimaginable that the army, who is not sure for whom they want to fight, falls apart as a card house. So people say the Afghan army hasn't fought. Can I tell you how many thousands of Afghan soldiers have been killed in that war in the last 4 or 5 years? So it's much too easy to say that. But it collapsed as a card house. The government collapsed, the international support collapsed, and the people who hedged on which side they would be negotiated as they have done historically with the groups that would be coming into power. That's the way I look at it. The same goes for the aid system. The aid system is unhealthily dependent on international funds. And I've been part and parcel of that, by the way. It's not so easy to change it. But if it's the case that 40%, 5% of the GDP and more than 70% of the budget, so all the civil servants are paid by external funds, that stops all at once, then yes, the doctors will not be paid, maternal mortality will increase. That's already, figure as a real prospect right now. Then again, you come for this dilemma that I just mentioned. You can talk about women's rights, but this is very, very difficult at this stage. Anyway.
Maybe, Bert, thank you so much for that very detailed answer. Thank you, Julia.
Sorry to be a bit long.
But no, very, very helpful. But I think we could spend a few more moments on the actual withdrawal and withdrawal decision, and come back to the consequences, both for the Afghan people and for the international community. But let's focus for a little bit on the withdrawal. And Marin, I think you might have a question about this and about the role perhaps of the Afghan authorities as well as the international. Perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself briefly and ask.
Hello, my name is Marin Christensen, and I am one of Professor Lee's Masters of European Public Policy students. We are the second year of the cohort, and we're only here for 1 year. So I appreciate you being here and being able to answer our questions. And I have 3 questions, but I believe you've touched on my first one, which was what was the responsibilities from an ethical and technical standpoint? What responsibilities do NATO allies have to the people of Afghanistan? And I believe you put it briefly as it depends on who starts to care to some extent, what foreign governments care, what the media says, how it's brought to light in a way. So you're welcome to touch on that more. My next question, I would love to hear both your political and personal opinion on this, and I'll see if I get away with it. Was former President Ashraf Ghani wrong to flee? And my final question is a little more European focused, and it's how has the manner of the US's withdrawal influenced calls for a joint European defense, and what would it take for these calls to be fulfilled?
Thanks very much, Marin. I think we're going to keep that last question for a little bit later, and maybe focus for a few moments actually on the withdrawal, and you're asking about President Biden's decision to leave, and I mentioned the embassies as well deciding to pull out. Was that the right decision? The timing of it, was it right? Was there anything else that could have done? I mean, I think the sort of consensus view in the media has been that the withdrawal probably was inevitable and probably was the right decision. And the main problem was the manner in which it was conducted. Would that be a fair judgment?
I think it's a fair judgment if you, sorry. I think it's so awkward to talk like that,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to do my best. Look, I think it's a fair assessment of what the assessment is in terms of, you know, the sort of general outlook when you listen to the press and so on and so forth.
Sorry about this.
No, it's not your fault.
It's
It's
a little.
is this okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You may feel a little bit handicapped. There's nothing we can do. Look, let me not be overly long on this. And also to where I come from. I was against this decision. Not because I don't understand it. I think President Biden came in 2009, called up my party leader, the Dutch parliament, saying you should stay, but also it was very clear already in 2009 that he had very good reasons to say we don't want in the US any unending wars. It's not only that we don't get the support from our own people, we have a lot of issues at home, economically, politically, culturally. This is a mission that is geared towards anti-terrorism and nation building, but it's not very well thought out. I mentioned some of the dilemmas we had throughout Iraq and all the other issues. And already in 2009, it was very clear that Biden said, I don't want this anymore. And by the way, geopolitically, and that came 10 years later, if the key issue is the relationship with the US and China, simplify now a little bit, why should we carry the geopolitical weight of all these issues? Let them find the balances in terms of regional politics and local politics in Afghanistan by them. Iran and Uzbekistan and China and Pakistan figures. That was the reasoning, which is a very sensible reason for the many reasons that as you mentioned, he was actually putting forward in 2020. Second, he had inherited and later owned the agreement between the Taliban and President Trump. And I have seen this a little bit from the distance. I've come from the side of the United Nations. There's one way you should negotiate, it's this way. Maybe you exclude the local government. You don't have any sense of inclusivity in mediation. You don't have any rules of accountability. You don't have any dispute settlement mechanism. It's a withdrawal. You say, I want to go, my people want to. Finished with Afghanistan for the many reasons, understandable reasons I just mentioned, we go. Now, Biden inherited that, which is sense, yes, this is the right direction. Second, he has already agreed with the Taliban. If I, go and stop this, the only thing I can do is escalate the war. That's what he said, and that will, cost even more lives. So that was more or less the reasoning in the Biden camp.
Do you think that was a fair judgment, or was that misleading? That his only alternative was to escalate? Was that?
No, I think it's wrong. I think it's really wrong, and nobody knows. It's a little bit of what if history. But my sense is here the following. Don't forget that, in fact, there were, 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers left of American troops in Afghanistan. The rest was NATO troops, which were actually European troops, which there were many more. It's about 7,000 to 8,000 people. Very few people realize that. There are two reasons why I don't agree with it. One is the reason not to escalate is actually unproved to be unproven, but it depends a little bit what you do. If you inherit an agreement, the question is what you do with it. He only changed the date. It might do in a very awkward way by saying in 9/11 everybody has to have left. So like 9/11, you started the war and you ended on the same terms. I didn't really understand that. But he needed a little bit more time. I'm not sure that escalation was needed. My sense was, and here a lot of people disagree, so to that point, sometimes you cannot solve a situation. You can't. You've been there too long, maybe you've made mistakes. You're there with 10,000 troops. Why would you actually have to leave? There were no Americans killed anymore in that war. The government was not very popular. It was not solving an issue, but it was managing an issue. And that's not very nice in our thinking, because we like to solve things. Me too, I don't pay you keep troops. I don't think it would have been impossible. Second, I do think for some it would be seen as naive, but that the Americans could have negotiated also with the Europeans and the countries in the region for some of the common interests. There's no country in the region that has an interest in terrorism, which by the way is on the rise at the moment in Afghanistan. So I don't think we can just that easily close the chapter as we just said at the beginning. It's been a field day for some of the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the terrorist organizations. And they have learned that, if you speak, if you talk, the famous talk is, we have you have the watch, but we have the time. That has already its repercussions in the Sahel and elsewhere. But anyway, that's another thing. So I think on the issue of escalation, I think it could have been prevented if you had active diplomacy. If you would have said, okay, there was already a bad deal between President Trump and the government. We ask also from our NATO allies to have some extra activities, at least to contain that situation. And let's take it from there. Can I prove that? No. Then the last point on issue, so you could have managed it, in my view. Nevertheless, there is a legitimate point of view as to why the Americans wanted to leave, in my view. And that's what became most dominant. And I think we see that more general in politics right now. There is a retrenchment, a regionalization of politics. I don't think in many countries international missions still get support in terms of domestic politics that you had maybe 20 years ago when this intervention started at the so-called unipolar moment. We are now in a completely different strategic situation. But I'm afraid the reality will be a little bit more different and fuzzy and clumsy and not as we expect. Because geopolitics is not only something between China and the US. Maybe geopolitics plays through these kind of crises, the way how we deal with it, the credibility.
Thanks very much for that very realistic response. Let's come back to some of the questions that you raised about the implications for all of this for the Afghan people and issues about the role of the Taliban, human rights, and so on. Usra, I think you have some questions about this. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself briefly and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Usra Azizi. I'm a second-year MA student. I'm originally from Afghanistan.
Where are you?
I'm from Jalalabad, Nangarhar province, but I was born in Peshawar, Pakistan. I lived there as a refugee for 14 years. And my first time in Afghanistan was right after the United States had gone into Afghanistan around 2000. Well, my family moved around 2002. I lived in Kabul until 2008, and then I went to the US for my studies. So that's about where I've been so far. I know in the beginning you mentioned, there has been a lot of effort put over the last 20 years. So much money poured in, troops were killed, both on international and Afghan, and a lot of sacrifices. People risked so much to go vote and so forth. So now the Afghan people in general don't really dwell much on what happened, but are more worried about what is going to happen going forward. So what is the international community doing, specifically, as you could speak about the Netherlands, for instance, to help reverse or stop the achievements of the last 20 years for the Afghan people? Because as you mentioned, there's, women are no longer in employment. Girls cannot go to school beyond 6th grade and so forth. The currency is already depreciated, and $1 used to be around 47 Afghanis around 2008. in August, it was around 75, and now it's dropped to almost 100. So their purchasing power is shrinking, and that has a lot of implications for people financially, economically. So what any efforts are on the way among the international community or the Netherlands to try to sort of help the Afghan people going forward? You could speak a little on that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for that absolutely key and crucial question. And it's great to meet somebody who really knows what she's talking about, because you are Afghan. And I remember being as Minister for International Development in the refugee camps in Peshawar in 2000, around Peshawar in northwestern Pakistan province at the time. And by the way, I think we have to understand some of the background of the Taliban, not as something that is coming from the Middle Ages, but was born into the refugee camps and the wrong education, if you wish, in that area. It's not just something that came out of the Middle Ages, something of the wrong narrative. Look, I think this is really a fight. The unfortunate thing is, as I said before, we have at the moment a situation in which all the assets of Afghanistan abroad are frozen. So it's around 9 to 10 billion euros or dollars, mostly in US banks, a few in. And I'm talking, by the way, here not in an official position at all, because I don't know the big figures exactly. I cannot politically speak about it. But my sense is that you have now a complete economic and social implosion in Afghanistan. That's why I was against this decision. And as I said, it's now a choice for those outside of Afghanistan, including the diaspora, but especially also Western countries and countries in the region. How do we deal and test with a government which is partly seen as a terrorist government? Some of them have been, as you know, in the Afghani network and others there on the lists. And how do you avoid what will be in practice a collective punishment of the Afghan people, including the women of Afghanistan? I think we have to be extremely inventive on this. First of all, not close the book. That would be, in my view, a betrayal. I see, at least in the European Union, at least, an enormous sense that we cannot leave this as such, sometimes given by maybe motivations that are very much related to terrorism and migration, which are legitimate concerns, but they should not be the first ones. And really think how we can, first of all, use simply technical issues. It is also a school, you know, this is Johns Hopkins science. How can we figure out the way that we, as we call it in financial terms, off balance, not through the government budget, keep on a payment system to the teachers, the nurses, and some of the civil servants in Afghanistan. Humanitarian aid will be first and foremost, that's for sure. There has been just a big UN conference. The EU has pledged 1 billion. The US has done some countries in the region bilaterally, but relatively small, including China and so on and so forth. So that will be, first of all, the foremost thing, simply goes to the winter. IDPs are high figures. There was already IDPs because of as you know, because of the conflict. Afghanistan is a country of climate change. Water management is key. That's something for the medium term, but nevertheless, it plays already out right now in terms of what we see some of the vulnerabilities. And we see an enormous implosion of the currency because there is no correspondent banking, the assets are abroad, the Afghani falls down the floor, the inflation goes up, and nobody can pay it. And don't forget, in Afghanistan, you can do humanitarian aid, that's important, but the medicine and the electricity and simply the vaccines have to be imported. Afghanistan is a great balance of payment deficit, financed externally, historically. So how do you deal with this? And in my view, we have to find as quickly as possible an international community that creates the authorizing environment to test the government there by saying we can do this and this and this according and make sure it's not getting confiscated. There are different views on this in the international community now. There are countries who say no, nothing, yeah, some humanitarian aid, but these other humanitarian plus aspects that deal with the real economic social situation of the country. They're not going to do that because the Taliban will sit back and, in fact, legitimize them. And that fight in the international community is still on. So, to answer your question more concretely, I think in the short term, for good and bad reasons, there will be a lot of humanitarian aid. Second, the extent to which that can be distributed in time this winter in Afghanistan, I'm not sure, but I'm also not overly pessimistic or optimistic. We simply don't know. But when it comes real to a social economic implosion of the country, including rises in maternal mortality, indicators that go back to, it's a very poor country. We have more than 50%, if I'm not wrong, maybe 45, under the poverty line. So people have the last element of protection is gone right now. The government has no money. It will be that effort right now in the UN, in the Bretton Woods institutions, in the region, to make sure that the page is not being turned. And that the combination of self-enlightened interest, if you wish, and ethical thinking makes the solution, at least for the next couple of months, possible. And makes it also possible to test the Taliban. I saw yesterday that the German government has now sent a special envoy on behalf of its government to discuss with the Taliban on aid, humanitarian aid. The European Union is reopening at least some presence in Kabul, will be still discussed how and what, not in terms of recognition, but in terms of that's real. I can't make it better, that's what it is.
Was there somebody from the country? What do you think? I mean, do you think that something can be saved? Do you think that by applying conditionality, the Taliban can be brought to preserve some of the benefits of the last few years, or do you think that a dialogue is possible?
I think a dialogue is necessary. I think a dialogue is necessary, especially because the international community will inevitably get involved through humanitarian aid means, let's say. And for an Afghan woman, let's say, I would be curious to see if in this dialogue they discuss human rights, basic human rights, and if they could apply any pressure or bring up, girls' education, women's employment, and so forth, to be able to save and preserve some of those achievements, because women do play a huge role in the social fabric. Civil society was very vibrant in the last 20 years. And they're very active in the rural areas. The government didn't have access in every single village, in every single province, but the civil society did. I personally worked with an organization one summer in college and was able to go to 40 villages across 7 provinces, and was able to interview over 500 people on the country's conditions, on whether teachers are receiving their salaries on time and so forth. Those findings were done by the civil society organizations and reported to the capital. So they do a lot more work than they're given credit for. And they now more than ever actually are relying on aid and access to these provinces, because the Taliban don't necessarily allow that kind of work at the moment right now. Most people are scared because of security reasons. And let's say if for education, at least until 6th grade, girls can go and study, but that doesn't mean every family is comfortable in the current conditions to send their kids to school. My father worked for the United Nations for 17 years in education, so it's very firsthand, information I had on this, on schools being closed, even in the last 20 years, on schools being burnt and so forth. So that fear of sending your kids to school was always there. And that means right now, even though if your daughter can attend school until 6th grade, doesn't necessarily mean the family will allow it. So they need to discuss, at least I'm hoping they would, in this dialogue with the Taliban, any government need, to discuss these, to create that room for people to be able to access what they had worked so hard for. So I think there could be a way to preserve the achievements, but it would have to happen through the international community's involvement in Afghanistan, while they provide humanitarian aid or aid of any other sort later on.
Thanks, Mr.
No, I think these are, First of all, you're much better expert than I am, that because you are from there. Your father worked, I guess, for UNICEF or
Yes, he said.
and UNICEF is a great organization that really works on the ground locally with in terms of education. Look, I'm not so pessimistic about the fact that the UN, Worldbank, the European donors will bring up these issues very forcefully. They will. So I'm not at all cynic about that. I think we have to protect the gains that have been made to the extent we can. The two issues which make this difficult from an analytical point of view. First, the war was lost. It's very unfortunate. That's why I was so against this decision, even if I understand why. Namely, if you lose something, you also lose power. That's true. We don't have the same influence that we used to have before, except that the Taliban also needs more legitimacy in the country itself. It's broke. There's 10 billion of assets abroad. That's not nada in terms of negotiating power. So we'll have to see how that's going to be used. If I have, I always say to students when I come somewhere, that's why it's good you're at this school. Life is now about figuring this out, how you do that. Where do you find food alumnus maneuver? Who are your coalitions? How can you make influence in something where you have lost less power? The Taliban, who doesn't like this stuff at all, and normally these kind of organizations radicalize rather than become more soft. It's 3 shows of the last 10, 15 years. How can we still try to do that? I would not exclude also dealing a bit more with the neighboring countries, although I know they have different interests. My fear is obviously that countries like China or Pakistan or Iran, they will look at Afghanistan as something that is now even more on their plate. But for them, the most important is anti-terrorism, especially for China, the movements that are related to the Uyghurs, and same goes in Pakistan for some of the Balochistan and other areas, and same goes for Iran. So they will not tend to prioritize these kind of things, unless you think it's destabilizing. And that's a problem, because issues like women's rights, protecting the gains and so on will be very key. So that will be a struggle as well. And third, it's also some of our own governments. In that dilemma, how do we deal? Are we proactively dealing with this issue or not? I was frankly not very much enthused, it's a very personal view, on the reaction of the European Union. It's now the best in terms of humanitarian aid. There was money, that's good. But the first reaction I saw was immediately on migration. So most of the money is we're going to Pakistan and to, and we talk all at once with governments we never spoke to on these issues. Turkey and Qatar are the key areas. I don't think I'm not saying that it's not an issue. Of course, we are worried about certain things regarding migration. And about terrorism, I think we still have a major issue, because I think that should concern you as well, and keen to know how you think about this. The Taliban is governing, but doesn't mean they have the power, or they can remain to have the power. The biggest risk for the Afghan people is renewed conflict, not only on the side of extremists. And here, those of you who followed the war in Iraq would learn lessons. Because what happened in Iraq was that the army of Saddam Hussein, who had lost power because of the American intervention, went to the terrorists from the ISIS. And I see similar risks in Afghanistan. That is ISK business. It's horrendous attacks in Kabul and in Jalalabad as well.
It's all about Kandahar also.
Kandahar. Awful for your people. That before you know it, there is a new exclusionary government which leads to new conflict, either of the terrorists or the terrorists. So in that sense, the book obviously isn't closed. And my plea is very much with you on trying to, from self-enlightened interest, if you wish, and the fact that you don't leave the country because you lost and you left and therefore you lost, and maybe you tried it in the wrong way, that this is still something that I would plead not to close that book yet, although I'm realistic in what I see now.
Very much, but I've got my eye on the clock, and so it's just we move forward, and if people would be thinking of any issues you might like to raise, we'll just take a last question from our panel and then open up to any other questions that you might have. Marin, your third question and really touches on the question of the implications for the European Union beyond assistance, but rather more in geopolitical terms, and the implications perhaps for transatlantic relations. Maybe you say a couple of words about that.
Yes, so my third question wasn't as much focused on the implications in Afghanistan so much as for Europe. So how has the manner of the US withdrawal influenced calls for joint European defense, and what would it take for these calls to be fulfilled? How has Europe responded, and how do you think the way the United States chose to leave without, I don't want to say without notifying allies, but without taking the advice of their European allies, influence calls for potential European defense, especially from the French perspective?
The last one is important.
Yeah. Adding in maybe just the fact that the coincidence or otherwise of timing with the AUKUS affair occurring more or less simultaneously, one more argument for strategic autonomy comes back again and again. Is this really a doctrine that we can expect to guide our foreign and security policy for the future? Do you take these calls seriously?
I take it very seriously, Michael, and I think you know enormous about it. I've been faced with this issue a lot as foreign minister. Look, on the relationship with Afghanistan and transatlantic relationship, European strategic autonomy, I think it's a ripple, and not an unimportant ripple, but not fundamental. It added to a range of issues that we've seen in the last couple of years. Why is it a little bit more than a ripple? Is that a good word? Yeah, ripple. Because of Article 5, almost NATO and not US, EU, but nevertheless, it was something fundamental in the sort of necessary war versus the chosen war of Iraq. It was the issue of here we really cooperated, and why didn't we then think more about if you go in together, how you go out together? It's not true that there were no discussions between the US and Europe within NATO, but the negotiations that President Trump, who was of course already America first, and the Union doesn't count, and we punish Germany, and we pick and choose whatever we want to do. That was a policy at the time. That the agreement between President Trump and the Taliban was not seriously discussed as to its implications, but wasn't even known very much inside the US itself. Khalid Dad was very much a person who worked secretly, which I understood, by the way, as a UN negotiator. If you want to negotiate, it's not so easy to do that in public. And I agreed with talking to the Taliban. I think it was a good idea. I think the government of Afghanistan itself made a lot of mistakes. I still have to answer the question on Ghana, by the way. But that's the reality. The problem was that when you went to NATO meetings, you would say it was not discussed. It was informed. Information exchange to a certain extent. But of course, Biden being very strong on this for the reasons I mentioned, the need to work on the internal politics, and with a certain amount of haste also because of the election to the US coming out. And the fact that the European Union, fair enough or not, and there is the relationship with strategic autonomy or more sovereignty or whatever you want to formulate it, came up because the Europeans knew they couldn't stay if the Americans left. So in the end, they could say, okay, we want it all differently. I think only the German minister had once proposed, and she wasn't supported by anybody, German Minister of Defense. She proposed maybe we should stay longer. The US is trying to attract its people to have a fair agreement. That never materialized because of the inequality in terms of assets, intelligence, and strategic strengths. The Europeans simply couldn't do that. So there was an element of hypocrisy also on the European side, which is, although in itself, because of Article 5, because of the fact that Biden has said now we are really going to a new relationship with Europe. If geopolitically we have an issue with Russia, and especially with China, let's do this together in terms of working on democracy and so on and so forth. It was definitely something of a disappointment. And I would say a little bit more than that. Although I think we should not underestimate the fact that if you are in an alliance or you believe in multilateralism, which I strongly believe, and I'm very happy that President Biden is there, it's enormous change, enormous. Paris, you name it. Iran, we still have to see, but nevertheless. But multilateralism doesn't mean there is not a stronger one and a weaker one, and it's being, also being used depending on. And frankly, the US has never been a great consultant when it comes to major strategic issues. It's mostly an afterthought. That's the reality as well. Having said all this, yes, it added for that reason to a momentum which is already there, but for much more strategic reasons, of the direction toward what is then sometimes called strategic autonomy. That started with the election, started already in 1999, I think, with Saint-Malo and so on, but really seriously with the Germans taking position on this, Mr. Merkel, who in my view had learned from Brexit and the election of President Trump and the possible re-election of President Trump, that the American engagement is very volatile, and therefore there is no exclusion, no direction than increasing the strategic autonomy, and that in a time of geopolitical rivalry, and the fact that especially the European neighborhood is very volatile, from Ukraine to Libya and so on, that this requires that direction. Now, does it mean it's going to happen? Look, the European Union, as you know, likes to have big ideas. And I think Michael and myself come a momentum that we actually probably believe in that a lot. And I do. So yes, I support this. But I take it with a lot of grace. Because it requires us to build, especially in Germany, but also in some other countries, a strategic culture, thinking about interests, thinking about where we have our comparative advantage, and of really thinking through with the Americans, where we share the burden and how we share control. I think the momentum is now. If it's going to happen, I don't know. We have the German elections. I don't know if they clarify that much on this. I think in the end, it's interesting that the center has kept ground there. We're getting Green foreign minister. This is not completely unlikely. There will be a tougher position towards China and the Russian Federation probably. And maybe that also allows for an improved relationship with the US. Greens are much more critical of NATO, but they're faced with the same issue of dependency there. In Italy, we'll see if there's going to be some elections. Maybe Draghi stays on over the summer with some deal, and then at the end of next year, I don't know what's going to happen there. People here know better. In France, it's still going to be very key as well. So the same strategic imperatives that we have in Europe and the US play in the same way. In the US, it is, you better realize that in Europe, the pivot is Asia. The emphasis is on domestic politics, a new type of investment state, and also including, interestingly enough, in the US, depending on what happens in the Congress, in which the internal coherence of the US will be key. By definition, that will mean which you should have realized already for some time, a different strategic political situation in Europe. And again, there also our internal politics and coherence will determine to what extent we export stability or we import instability. And the jury is still out.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap up, could I ask whether there are any other questions from those of you present or online? Yes, please do.
I'm sorry. My name is Elisa. I'm in the International Relations Masters. And I have actually two very short questions. The first one has to do with the subject of withdrawal, but 20 years ago. And I was wondering if at the time of the assessment of the US involvement, were there any talks of withdrawal at that specific moment? Because you mentioned the international solidarity for the US going back into Afghanistan, but I was just wondering if withdrawal was even on the table at that moment in history. The second one has to do with the EU. Are there any specific names or colleagues of yours that you think will be leading the EU talks in Kabul moving forward that we should keep an eye out for?
Look, on the first question, the issue was not so much withdrawal, the question was intervention. Because there were no troops in Afghanistan. So the question was, as I said in the beginning of the talk, would a terrorist attack of this nature and this size and this threat be answered best by a military intervention and tactical warfare, or were there other alternatives? And don't forget, of course, that when a country is hurt in its soul and in its key, key position in the world, that answer was not just one of a theoretical nature. And it was also very understandable positioning there because of the way that the Taliban looked at the issue of Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth. So there was not an issue of withdrawal. There should have been an issue. And there, it can be emotional in international politics, but what's the day after next? What does it mean if you do that? Is it good that you only talk to the Northern Alliance? What is the future of a government? I mean, even if you have to sometimes not have a lot of time to think, the question is a little bit, what do you think first before you do? Anyway, sometimes it goes like this. I think this was unavoidable, in my view. Some of it could have been repaired afterwards, but that's what it is. The last is on who you should invite next on this. Well, somebody who, in the European Union, I would very much look at. It's not so easy to say from here. Maybe you can help because you've worked so long for the European Union. I think it's interesting to look at. Again, there is now a German envoy go. Yes, on humanitarian aid, but on the issues you are talking about. Conditionality, at least engage, see the limits of that, try it out. I think from the countries that, in general, you can have some issue around the role of Germany in international strategic matters. France is normally the more, Sahel and other countries, Middle Eastern, more thinking country. But on Afghanistan, it's definitely Germany. Germany's been always engaged militarily. They have substantial troops up until the end. They've been part of the negotiations in Qatar with the Taliban, also after the agreement of President Trump. Yeah, they have a really strong diaspora from Afghanistan. I think they would be the most interesting to check this out. And maybe Mr. Potzel, who is the next, who is I think the special envoy, could be he would love to eat the pasta in Bologna church and meet with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being so generous with your time throughout the day and not only this evening. I think we sense in your answers not only a profound knowledge, but also a profound engagement and commitment on these issues, which I think we all appreciate very much. Thanks to our student panel and to all those online and in person who've come along on this rainy evening. And we look forward to greeting you again soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
And I've got a son.